My son's bride-to-be looked at me and said my only purpose at their wedding was to be a walking ATM. After I had paid for every last detail of her fantasy event, she told me to get out and never come back. She never expected that I'd take the entire $500,000 wedding with me. If you believe that respect is earned, not bought, hit the like and subscribe button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story of a lesson learned travels. My name is Harrison Blackwood, and at 68 years old, I thought I had seen everything. I've spent my life as an architect building foundations meant to last for generations. But I was standing in a place with no soul, the Museum of Modern Art, a sterile white cavern my son's fiancée had chosen for their wedding. The place felt cold, like a surgical theater, all polished concrete floors and twisted metal sculptures that screamed in silence. My tailored suit felt more restrictive than any hard hat I'd ever worn. I was an old oak tree trying to find roots in a glass box. Everything was a performance. The guests glided past each other, champagne flutes held like props, their laughter echoing a little too loudly in the cavernous space, disappearing without a trace of warmth. This was Brittany's world, a world curated for pictures valued by price tags and built on the flimsy foundation of social media likes. A deep, familiar voice broke through my thoughts. "You look about as comfortable as a fish in a tree, H." It was Otis Bell, my best friend. We'd known each other for 40 years, two young black men trying to build something real in a world that wasn't always ready for us. Now he owned the most sought-after catering company in the state. He stood there in his crisp chef's whites, but his eyes held the same warmth and understanding they always had. "Just a little out of my element, oh," I said, taking a sip of sparkling water. "I'm used to places with more heart and less polish." Otis chuckled a low rumble. "I hear you. This place makes my famous slow-smoked brisket feel self-conscious. But you gotta admit, this Brittany girl sure knows how to spend your money." He wasn't being cruel, just honest. I'd signed the checks. The check for the venue, the check for the orchids flown in from some remote island, the check for the string quartet playing music so generic it felt like a soundtrack for a luxury car commercial. I did it for Jordan, my son. I wanted him to be happy. But looking at him now standing beside Brittany, forcing a smile for the photographer, I didn't see happiness. I saw a man playing a part he hadn't auditioned for. Across the hall, Terrence Green, a jazz legend, and my closest confidant signaled for his band to take a break. He walked toward us, his trumpet case in hand. "Harrison, are you sure about this? At last? In the middle of all this classical stuff?" A genuine smile touched my lips for the first time that evening. "I'm sure, T. That was Diane's song. She deserves to be here tonight in some small way. My late wife Diane was the architect of my heart. Everything I built was for her." Terrence nodded, his eyes full of a shared history. "For Diane, I'd play the blues at the Vatican." Just then, Brittany drifted towards us. She moved like a storm cloud in a $1,000 dress, her smile a perfectly practiced, polite mask. She gave a curt nod to Otis and Terrence before fixing her gaze on me. "Mr. Blackwood, could I have a word with you in private?" The sweetness in her voice was thin, like a layer of ice over a frozen lake. I nodded and followed her into a smaller gallery dominated by a single red sculpture that looked like a car wreck. The moment we were out of sight, her smile vanished. "What do you think you're doing?" she snapped, her voice a low hiss. "I'm not sure I follow," I replied, my own voice steady. "Don't play dumb with me," she seethed. "At last, Etta James. Are you trying to turn my wedding into a memorial service for your dead wife?" The words were designed to wound, and they did. But I refused to let her see it. "I need you to understand something. This is our day, our beginning. It's a new brand. It's not a tribute to the past." I looked at her. Truly looked at the woman my son had chosen to marry. I saw a bottomless pit of insecurity, a hunger for status that could never be filled. She was Jordan's mother. It was the first song we ever danced to. I thought it would be a beautiful gesture. "Your gestures are obsolete," she cut me off, her voice rising. "Don't you get it? Your time is over. The time for those sentimental memories is over. Your legacy, your only value to us now is your bank account. And you've already paid for this party." She took a step closer, her cold blue eyes boring into mine. "Thank you for footing the bill. Now you can leave." I stood there silent, letting her ugly words hang in the air between us. The silence seemed to infuriate her more than any argument would have. "Are you deaf?" She spat her patience gone. "Get out of here. Get out, and don't ever come back. You are not welcome here." And that was it. The final crack in the foundation. In that moment, I didn't feel anger or even pain. All I felt was a sudden, chilling clarity. It was the feeling an architect gets when he finds the fatal flaw in a blueprint. All the little moments from the past 2 years, all the subtle insults, the constant requests for money, all of it clicked into place. I was looking at the complete design of their betrayal. My silence unnerved her. And then I did something she didn't expect. I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who finally understood the full scope of the problem and knew exactly how to fix it. "All right, Brittany," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. "You've made yourself perfectly clear. I'll leave, but I won't be leaving alone." She smirked a cruel, triumphant expression. "Oh, really? Who are you taking with you, the ghost of your wife?" I didn't answer. I simply took my phone from my pocket. My fingers moved with practiced precision across the screen. I sent 2 short texts, one to Otis, one to Terrence. The message was the same: Plan B. Execute now. I put the phone away and met her gaze one last time. "Good luck with your party." I turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the twisted red metal. She was still savoring her victory, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just handed me the detonator. I walked out of the gallery and went straight to Terrence. He'd gotten the message. Without a word, he and his band started packing their instruments. It was quiet, efficient, professional. I gave him a slight nod. He understood everything. Next, I walked to the catering area. Otis saw me coming. Our eyes met across the room. He gave me a single, sharp nod. He'd gotten the message too. He gave a quiet order to his staff. Immediately, they stopped what they were doing. The wine stopped pouring. The waiters began covering trays of exquisite food with foil. They moved with the silent efficiency of a well-trained army. The change was so sudden, so quiet, that at first the guests didn't notice. But then the silence hit them. The music, the lifeblood of the event, was gone. A confused murmur spread through the crowd. Why was the band leaving? Why were the caterers packing up? Where was the main course? Jordan ran up to me, his face pale with panic. "Dad, what's going on? Why is everything stopping?" I looked at my son, my heart aching for the man he was supposed to be. "You should ask your bride," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "She told me I wasn't welcome here. Since I'm the one paying for all this, I figured my vendors should leave with their client." Just then, Brittany emerged from the gallery, a smug look still on her face. But her expression crumbled as she took in the scene. The life was draining out of her perfect party. She saw the band walking out. She saw the caterers wheeling away carts of food that would never be served. She saw Otis and Terrence, my oldest friends, standing by my side, ready to walk out with me. And then her eyes landed on me, the old, obsolete man she had just discarded. Her gaze shifted from confusion to panic, and finally, to horrified realization. When she finally understood who was leaving with me, not just an old man, but the entire foundation of her glamorous fantasy, she screamed. It was a raw, ugly sound of pure fury and utter defeat echoing off the cold white walls of the museum. It was the sound of a bill coming due. I turned my back on the scream and on the wreckage of the party and walked out into the cool night air, my friends by my side. The foundation had cracked and it was time to build something new. I drove away from the museum, my hands steady on the worn leather of the steering wheel. My car, a vintage Jaguar XJ6, hummed quietly, its classic engine a stark contrast to the chaos I had just unleashed. The city lights streaked past the windows, blurring into abstract paintings of red and gold. Inside the car, there was only the soft glow of the dashboard and the quiet sound of my own breathing. I had expected to feel a storm inside me. Grief for my son, rage at the woman who had poisoned his mind, but there was no storm. Instead, there was a profound, unsettling calm. It was the quiet that comes after a building is demolished. The dust settles, and for the first time you can see the sky clearly. Brittany's scream was still echoing in my mind, but it was losing its power, fading like a bad dream. I realized with a sense of shock that I felt liberated. For 2 years I had been living in a house with a cracked foundation, pretending the walls weren't about to collapse. I had been slowly suffocated by 1,000 small compromises. 1,000 moments where I bit my tongue for the sake of a peace that was never real. I had been funding my own disrespect, writing checks to pay for my own erasure from my son's life. Tonight wasn't an act of destruction, it was an act of survival. It was the moment I stopped trying to patch the cracks and finally decided to tear down the rotten structure. I had loved Jordan with every fiber of my being. I still did. But the man I saw tonight with his hollow smile and frightened eyes was a stranger, a ghost, wearing my son's face. He had made his choice long before this evening. He chose the glittering, empty promise of Brittany's world over the solid, unglamorous love that had raised him. He had mistaken my patience for weakness, my generosity for an endless resource he was entitled to. He had forgotten the first rule I ever taught him as an architect and as a father: a beautiful facade is worthless if the foundation is corrupt. The structure will inevitably collapse. As I took the long way home, driving along the lakefront, a slow jazz tune began to play on the radio. It wasn't our song, not Diane's song, but it was from our time. A time when love was a quiet thing you built together day by day, not a brand you marketed to the world. And the music combined with the gentle motion of the car pulled a memory to the surface. It was so clear, so vivid, it felt like it had happened yesterday. It was the beginning of the rot. The first almost invisible crack in the foundation that I had foolishly ignored. It was the day Jordan first brought Brittany to the house I had designed and built for Diane, every line and every window a testament to our life together. I remembered the way the air grew colder when she walked in, the way she looked at our home not as a place of love and memory, but as an asset on a balance sheet. I had dismissed the feeling back then. I had told myself I was being an overprotective father, an old man resistant to change. I was wrong. I was an expert in foundations, and my gut had been telling me from the very beginning that this one was unstable. Tonight, I had simply acted on that long overdue structural report. The demolition was complete. Now it was time to remember how it all began. The change in my son began the day he brought Brittany to my home for the first time. It was a Sunday afternoon in early fall, the kind of day Diane had loved most. The sunlight streamed through the large windows of the living room, illuminating the specks of dust dancing in the air and warming the dark wood of the floors. The house was filled with the smell of roasting chicken and the sound of a Miles Davis record playing softly on the turntable. It was a house built for comfort, not for show. Every piece of furniture, every book on the shelves held a story. When the doorbell rang, Jordan stood on the porch with a woman who seemed to have been assembled in a showroom. Brittany was flawless. Her white dress was immaculate, her blonde hair was perfect, her smile was a bright, polished veneer. There was not a single thing out of place, and that I realized later was the first warning sign. Jordan was nervous, more nervous than I'd ever seen him. He fussed over her, taking her coat, offering her a drink, laughing a little too loudly at her jokes. He was performing for her. "Dad, this is Brittany," he said, his voice brimming with a kind of anxious pride. "Babe, this is my dad, Harrison." She extended a hand, her grip firm and cool. "It's such an honor to finally meet you, Mr. Blackwood," she said. "Jordan talks about you all the time. You're a legend." It was the right thing to say, but it felt rehearsed. I led them into the living room, the room where Jordan had taken his first steps, where Diane and I had danced on countless evenings. Brittany's eyes scanned the space, but she wasn't seeing the memories. She was assessing the inventory. She passed by the worn leather armchair where I'd read to Jordan every night for years. "That's a classic Eames," she remarked. "Not to me, but to Jordan. A bit dated, though. You could get it reupholstered in a lighter fabric to modernize it." Jordan, my son, who had always loved that chair, nodded eagerly. "Yeah, I was just telling Dad his style is very traditional, but the market now is all about that clean, minimalist aesthetic, right, babe?" He looked at her, desperate for her approval. He was parroting her language, her values. He gestured toward the solid oak bookshelf I had built with my own hands. "We could probably replace that with some floating shelves. Open up the space." I said nothing. I just watched as the son I knew began to fade, replaced by this new version, a man who saw his childhood home not as a sanctuary, but as a project to be renovated, to be stripped of its history and remade in the image of a soulless magazine spread. He was ashamed of the very things that had made him who he was, and he was letting this woman guide the wrecking ball. Brittany's assessment of my home was only the beginning. Her real objective was to assess its owner. She was a master of a certain kind of conversational warfare, the kind where the attacks are so skillfully disguised as compliments that you don't realize you're bleeding until it's too late. As we sat down to dinner, she began her gentle, relentless interrogation. "Jordan tells me this whole neighborhood has just skyrocketed in value," she said gracefully, cutting into her chicken. "This property with the lakefront access, the land alone must be worth a fortune. Have you had it appraised recently? It's just so important to keep your portfolio diversified and properly valued." She said the word portfolio as if she were talking about the weather. It was casual, clinical. I told her I hadn't, that I thought of the house as a home, not an asset. She smiled, a patient, condescending smile. "Of course. But a home is the biggest asset most people have. It's only smart to know its potential." Later, as I gave her a tour, she didn't ask about the family photos on the wall or the handmade quilt Diane had made that lay on our bed. She asked about the age of the roof, the efficiency of the heating system, the property taxes. Each question was wrapped in the language of practical concern. "Oh, these original hardwood floors are stunning. Maintaining them must be quite an expense, though." Then the pivot. "Jordan says you were so brilliant with your investments before you retired. It must be such a comfort to have that kind of financial security. So many people from your generation didn't plan properly." She was framing her questions as admiration, but what she was really doing was mapping out my financial landscape. She was trying to find out exactly how much there was, how much she could expect, how much Jordan was set to inherit. Jordan followed along, nodding, adding details I had shared with him in confidence. "Yeah, Dad was one of the first to invest in those tech startups back in the day. He saw the future. He was so proud, so desperate to impress her that he didn't see he was handing her the keys to our family's history, our family's security. I saw it, though. In that moment, I saw her for what she was, a prospector panning for gold in the river of my life's work, and my son was the one showing her where to dig." The erosion began subtly with a series of conversations that felt more like corporate pitches than family discussions. The first major request for money came about 6 months after I first met Brittany. They invited me to brunch at a trendy, overpriced restaurant where the food was artfully arranged but barely filled the plate. After some awkward small talk, Brittany placed her phone on the table and slid it towards me. On the screen was a slick presentation for an app. She called it Aura. It was, in her words, a curated lifestyle platform designed to connect high-net-worth individuals with bespoke artisanal experiences. The presentation was filled with buzzwords like synergy, monetization, and authenticity. It was beautifully designed and utterly meaningless. Jordan watched me, his eyes wide with a desperate, manufactured excitement. "Isn't it brilliant, Dad? It's a total market disruptor. We're getting in on the ground floor. All we need is some seed capital to get the development off the ground." I scrolled through the slides. There were pictures of people doing pottery, laughing at wine tastings, and arranging flowers. There were no financial projections, no business model, no clear explanation of how the company would actually make money. I looked up from the phone. I didn't say it was a terrible idea. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked the questions I would ask any contractor who came to me with a blueprint. "Who are your paying customers?" I asked. "Fees. Is it the users or the artisans providing the experiences? What's the revenue sharing model? What are your projected operational costs for the first 2 years? And how does that compare to your most conservative revenue forecast?" Brittany's smile tightened just a fraction of an inch. Jordan shifted uncomfortably. "Well, we're still in the conceptual phase," Brittany said smoothly. "The key right now is to build the brand to create a community. The monetization will follow naturally once we have an engaged user base." Jordan jumped in. "Exactly. It's like Facebook, Dad. They didn't worry about profit at first. They focused on growth." Comparing this vague, elitist app to one of the most powerful companies on the planet was absurd, and I knew he knew it. He was just repeating a script she had fed him. I said nothing for a long moment. I just looked at my son, and I saw how badly he wanted this, how badly he wanted her approval. So I nodded slowly. "All right. Send me a formal proposal with the amount you need." A week later, an email arrived. The proposal was just as vague, but the amount was very specific. $50,000. I went to my study, logged into my bank account, and initiated the wire transfer. In the memo line, I typed "loan for Aura app development." I saved a PDF of the confirmation in a new folder on my computer. I named the folder "Documentation." The second request came 8 months later. The Aura app had launched and predictably had gone nowhere. It was a ghost town of unbooked experiences. Jordan and Brittany came to the house for dinner. This time their approach was different. It wasn't excitement. It was a carefully constructed panic. Brittany explained that the app wasn't the problem. The problem was marketing. "We need to generate buzz," she said, pushing a piece of salmon around her plate. "We need to show people the kind of exclusive lifestyle Aura represents." She then unveiled her grand new plan. She wanted to host an all-expenses-paid influencer retreat in Bali. She would fly 10 of her blogger and influencer friends to a luxury villa for a week to generate organic content that would drive traffic to the app. It was a lavish vacation masquerading as a business expense. This time I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. "Let me see if I understand," I said, my voice even. "You want to spend a significant amount of money flying people to Indonesia in the hope that they post some pictures on the internet that might lead to a few app downloads?" Jordan's face flushed with frustration. "You don't get it, Dad. It's about perception. It's about brand alignment. You have to spend money to make money. That's how modern business works." He was talking down to me, a man who had built a multi-million-dollar architectural firm from nothing. He was treating me like I was a relic who didn't understand the new world. I asked to see a budget for this retreat. The document they produced was a joke. It listed expenses for business-class flights, a private chef, and daily spa treatments. I looked at the total at the bottom, $75,000. I pushed the paper back across the table. "Jordan, the return on this investment seems speculative at best." My son's face fell. He looked wounded, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to come to me for help with his math homework. Then his expression hardened, and he looked at Brittany, who gave him a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. He turned back to me. "Please, Dad," he said, his voice quiet and heavy with manipulation. "This is really important. To Brittany. To us. We can't let this dream die because of a temporary cash flow problem." He used the word us. It was a deliberate choice meant to make me feel like I was the obstacle standing in the way of his happiness, of their shared future. I knew in that moment that I was being played. I knew I was funding their delusion. But I also knew that arguing would get me nowhere. They would twist my concern into cruelty, my wisdom into a lack of faith. So again, I relented. The next day, I made the transfer. In the memo line, I wrote "Loan for Bali Marketing Event," and I saved the confirmation in the same folder right next to the first one. I wasn't just losing money, I was building a case. The final crack in the foundation, the one that proved the entire structure was unsalvageable, came when we discussed the wedding itself. I had invited them over for dinner, hoping for a moment of genuine connection away from the noise of their new life. After we ate, I spread a hand-drawn sketch across the dining room table. It was a simple, elegant plan for a wedding ceremony at the lake house. I envisioned it taking place in late spring in the garden Diane had spent decades cultivating, with the scent of roses in the air and the sound of the lake lapping gently in the background. It would be intimate, meaningful, and deeply personal. We could have the reception on the great lawn, I said, my voice filled with a hopeful warmth. Otis could do the catering, Terrence and his band could play. It would be a celebration, not a production. Something real. Brittany looked at the sketch for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She didn't dismiss it immediately. She was too clever for that. She picked it up, holding it as if it were a curious, primitive artifact. "Harrison, this is a very sweet thought." She began the word sweet, landing like a drop of poison. "It's very quaint, but we have to think about the guest experience. The logistics of getting 200 people out to the lake are a nightmare. And honestly, a backyard wedding doesn't really align with the brand we're trying to build." The brand. There was that word again. She spoke of her marriage as if it were a new product she was launching. She wasn't building a life, she was building a brand. I turned to my son. "Jordan, remember those summers we spent at that house learning to fish off the dock? The bonfires at night? That place is our family's history." I was pleading with him, trying to reach the boy I had raised, the one who understood the value of things that couldn't be bought. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at the salt shaker on the table. It's a bit rustic, Dad," he mumbled. "Brittany has her heart set on something more sophisticated." Brittany saw her opening and seized it. She put my sketch aside and pulled out her tablet, tapping the screen to life. It displayed a picture of the Museum of Modern Art, cold white and enormous. "This is the vision," she said, her voice now animated, passionate. "Clean lines, high-end catering. A string quartet. It makes a statement. It says that we are a power couple, that we are the future. I looked at the projected cost she had prepared. It was astronomical. It was more than the down payment I had made on my first dozen construction projects combined. Brittany, this is an incredible expense, I said, trying to keep my voice reasonable. A wedding is about the commitment, not the venue. We could use that money for a down payment on a house for you two. A real foundation. This was my last attempt. A final appeal to logic, to the values I had tried to instill in my son. Brittany scoffed a small, ugly sound. But it was Jordan's response that shattered me. He finally looked up from the salt shaker and his eyes were cold. He was annoyed. Annoyed that I was being so difficult, so impractical. "Dad, it's just money," he said, his voice flat. "We can always make more money. But we only get one chance to make this kind of impression. Brittany's reputation, our reputation, is worth more than that. It's just money." Those 3 words struck me with the force of a physical blow. All the years of my hard work, the sacrifices Diane and I had made, the legacy I had built to give him a better life, he had just dismissed it all. It was just money. And it was worth less than the fleeting social status of a woman who saw our family as a stepping stone. In that moment, the fight went out of me. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the revelation that the son I knew was gone. A door had slammed shut inside my heart, a heavy final sound. The person I was trying to save no longer existed. So I just nodded. I looked at the sterile picture of the museum on the tablet, and I nodded. "If that's what will make you happy," I said quietly, "then that's what we'll do." They saw my agreement as a victory. I knew it was a surrender. I was no longer funding a wedding. I was funding the end of my family, and I would document every last cent. The meeting that sealed their fate took place 3 months before the wedding on a cold Tuesday morning. Jordan had called me the night before, his voice buzzing with an artificial energy. He said he and Brittany had been working on a project, something really exciting for my future, and they wanted to present it to me formally. The word formally hung in the air like a threat. I agreed, suggesting they come to the house. I wanted this conversation to happen on my territory in my study, surrounded by the books and blueprints that represented a lifetime of honest work. I felt a cold sense of dread settle in my bones. I knew this wasn't going to be a presentation. It was going to be an ambush. They arrived precisely at 10 a.m., dressed not for a family visit but for a corporate takeover. Jordan was in a suit that was too slick for him, and Brittany wore a sharp blazer carrying a leather portfolio. She was the one who began, her voice radiating a practiced, predatory enthusiasm. "Harrison, thank you so much for seeing us." She started laying out a series of glossy brochures on my antique oak desk. The images were of smiling, silver-haired seniors playing tennis, taking art classes, and dining in elegant hotel-like restaurants. "We know that since you've retired, you've been a little isolated out here. So we've been doing some research, looking for a way to optimize your lifestyle for the next chapter." I looked at the brochure. Evergreen Meadows, a premier lifestyle community. It was a retirement home dressed up in the language of a luxury resort. "It's not a retirement home, Harrison," she said, as if reading my mind. "It's a vibrant community of your peers. Think of it as a permanent vacation. No more worrying about mowing the lawn, fixing a leaky roof, or cleaning the gutters. It's about freedom." Jordan nodded eagerly beside her, a puppet on a string. "Think of all the upkeep on this place, Dad. The property taxes alone are a huge drain. This move is it's a smart financial decision." He said it with the detached air of a financial advisor discussing a stranger's portfolio, not a son talking about the home he grew up in. I remained silent, letting them lay out the full extent of their plan. My silence seemed to encourage them, making them think I was considering their proposal. Then Brittany delivered the masterstroke, the true purpose of their visit. "The best part," she said, leaning forward, her eyes gleaming, "is how we can make this a win-win for the entire family." She slid another document across the desk. It was a real estate market analysis for my neighborhood with my address highlighted at the top. "Your house has appreciated to an incredible degree. It's a seller's market. If we list it now, we can get top dollar." I stared at the paper. They had already had my home appraised. They had already done the math. Jordan finally spoke up, laying out the ugly details with a chilling casualness. "So the plan is simple. We sell the house. The proceeds will be more than enough to cover the entrance fee for Evergreen Meadows for you. And with the rest," he took a deep breath, "we can finally afford a down payment on a place of our own in the city. A proper place for us to start our family." There it was. The full blueprint of their greed. They weren't planning my retirement, they were liquidating my life. They intended to sell the home I had built with my own hands, the sanctuary where I had raised my son, the place where every corner held a memory of Diane. They would use that sacred money to fund their own lavish lifestyle, and in exchange they would store me away in a gilded cage until I died. I listened, but I wasn't really hearing the words anymore. I was looking at the architecture of their betrayal. I saw every lie, every manipulation, every calculated move that had led to this moment. They were talking about my life as if it were a property to be flipped for a profit. The structural integrity of our family, the foundation of love and respect I thought I had built, was gone. It had been a facade all along. I looked at my son. I looked into his eyes, searching for a flicker of doubt, a hint of shame, a trace of the boy who once believed that a home was more than just an asset. I found nothing. He just looked back at me, waiting for my answer, a hopeful, expectant look on his face. He truly believed this was a good idea. He saw no betrayal, no disrespect. He only saw a logical solution to a financial problem, and the problem was me. My life. My home. After a long, heavy silence that filled every corner of the room, I finally spoke. My voice was quiet, devoid of all emotion. I pushed their glossy brochures and market analyses back towards them. "You've given me a lot to think about," I said. "Let me review this." They took my calmness as a sign of consideration of a potential victory. Brittany smiled a triumphant little smirk. They had no idea what they had just done. They had expected an argument, an emotional outburst. They had prepared for a fight. They were not prepared for the dead, quiet calm of a man who had just confirmed his worst fears and was now finally ready to act. They had presented me with their plan. Now it was time for me to start working on mine. The day after their ambush, I did not call my son. I did not rage or grieve. I took the folder I had named Documentation, and I made an appointment. I didn't go to the old family lawyer who had handled my will for 30 years, a kind man who would have offered me platitudes and lukewarm tea. I had no need for sympathy. I needed a surgeon. My research led me to a high-rise building downtown, to a law firm with a name made of sharp, modern angles. The office of Kendra James was on the 35th floor with a view that stretched across the entire city. The space was like the woman herself, minimalist, precise, and powerful. There were no family photos on her desk, no sentimental clutter. There was just a sleek laptop, a single black pen, and a block of polished granite that served as a paperweight. The air was cool and smelled faintly of steel and glass. Kendra James was a woman who looked to be in her late 30s, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that was both elegant and severe. She didn't smile when she greeted me. She simply shook my hand, her grip firm and brief, and gestured for me to sit. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice a calm, low-pitched instrument of efficiency. "Your assistant said it was a matter of asset protection. Please tell me what you're facing." I didn't begin with a story of a broken heart. An architect does not begin a project by describing his feelings about the building. He begins with the blueprints. I opened my briefcase and placed the thick folder on her glass desk. The sound was a soft, definitive thud in the quiet room. "Ms. James." I began, my voice as steady as my hand. "I am the founder and sole owner of a lifetime of assets, and I am currently facing a hostile takeover attempt from within my own family. This folder contains the preliminary documents of their proposal. I opened the folder and laid out the evidence in a neat row, just as I would lay out architectural plans for a client. First, the glossy brochure for the luxury retirement community. Second, the unsolicited real estate appraisal of my home. Third, I placed the printouts of the wire transfers, each one annotated with the date and the stated purpose of the loan. Finally, I added a copy of the invoices I had already paid for the wedding, all of which were billed to my company Blackwood Designs, not to me personally. I watched her as she worked. She didn't offer a single word of comfort. She simply put on a pair of sleek black-framed glasses and began to read. Her focus was absolute. She examined each document with the same detached intensity a structural engineer would use to search for a hairline fracture in a support beam. She was not reading a family tragedy. She was analyzing a contract, searching for weaknesses for points of leverage. She picked up the confirmation for the $75,000 transfer. "This loan for Bali marketing event," she said, her eyes not leaving the page. "Was there a promissory note signed? Any formal repayment schedule agreed upon?" "No," I replied. It was a verbal agreement between a father and a son. So legally, it was a gift she stated not as a question but as a fact. She moved on to the next document. And these wedding contracts. Billing them to your corporation was an interesting choice. Was that intentional? Yes, I said. I've learned over the years that it's always wise to maintain a professional buffer. A flicker of something that might have been admiration crossed her face for a fraction of a second, and then it was gone. She leaned back in her chair, her fingertips steepled together. She was no longer analyzing, she was strategizing. Mr. Blackwood, she began, her voice crisp. Emotionally, your situation is complex. Legally, it is remarkably straightforward. Your son and his fiancée have made a critical error. They have mistaken your generosity for a legal obligation. They have built their entire plan on a foundation of assumptions, and a legal case built on assumptions is like a house built on sand. She leaned forward again. They want to liquidate your primary asset, your home. So we will remove that asset from the equation entirely. I will draft the paperwork to place your property into an irrevocable trust effective immediately. We will name it the Diane Blackwood Legacy Trust. You will be the trustee. Upon your death, the trust will have a new beneficiary. I would recommend a charity or an educational institution you admire. Your son can be granted lifetime residency provided he pays all taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs himself. He will be able to live in the house, but he will never be able to sell it or borrow against it. It will be a home, not an ATM. The plan was clean, cold, and perfect. What about the money I've already given them, I asked. The gifts, she corrected me gently. We will draft promissory notes for each amount. We will send them to your son for his signature, formalizing them as legal debts with a standard interest rate. He will likely refuse to sign. That's fine. His refusal will be a matter of record useful should he ever attempt to claim in probate court that you intended to fund his life indefinitely. It establishes a pattern. Finally, she tapped the wedding invoices. And this is your leverage. Your corporation is the client. If the client is insulted, asked to leave the premises, the client has every right to terminate the services of its vendors. It's clean. It's business. She laid out the entire strategy with the passionless precision of a master chess player explaining a checkmate sequence. There was no talk of revenge, no language of payback. There was only the clinical application of the law to protect what was mine. She was not offering to help me win a family fight. She was offering to help me enforce the terms of a contract that my son had unknowingly violated. I looked at this sharp, brilliant woman and I felt the first glimmer of hope I had felt in months. I had come to her with a crumbling foundation. She had just handed me a new set of blueprints drawn in steel. Ms. James, I said, my voice clear and resolved. Please proceed. Over the next 2 weeks, I moved with the quiet efficiency of a man executing a set of blueprints he knew by heart. The first and most important step was to build a fortress around the heart of my legacy, the house. Kendra James drafted the documents for the irrevocable trust with the precision of a master cartographer mapping out a new, unbreachable border. I sat in her office and read every word. The legal language was dense, but the architecture of the plan was simple and beautiful in its strength. The property would be transferred into a new entity, the Diane Blackwood Legacy Trust. It was no longer just a house. It was a monument to her memory, and it would be protected by the full force of the law. I was the trustee, the guardian of that legacy for as long as I lived. But the true genius of the structure was what happened after I was gone. The trust's new beneficiary would not be Jordan. It would be the School of Architecture at my old university, a place that had given me my start, a place Diane and I had supported for years. The trust would fund a scholarship for underprivileged students in her name forever. A clause was inserted, a single paragraph that acted as both a kindness and a cage. Jordan would be granted the right to live in the house for the remainder of his life. He could raise his family there, walk the same halls he did as a child, and enjoy the shelter I had built. But he would never be its owner. He could never sell it, never borrow against it, never treat it as a line item in his portfolio. He was also responsible for all of it, the taxes, the insurance, the upkeep. He was being given the responsibility of a home without the financial prize Brittany so desperately craved. It was no longer an asset to be liquidated. It was a legacy to be maintained. Signing that document didn't feel like an act of revenge. It felt like an act of preservation. I was protecting my wife's memory from the very people who should have been its most devoted guardians. Next, Kendra turned her attention to the financial bleeding. She took the printouts of the wire transfers, the $125,000 I had poured into their fantasies, and she began to build a different kind of structure, a structure of debt. She drafted 2 legally binding promissory notes, one for $50,000 for the failed app, the other for $75,000 for the influencer vacation in Bali. Each document was a quiet legal statement. It transformed what they saw as an entitlement into a debt. It retroactively reclassified my generosity as a formal loan, complete with a modest standard interest rate and a clear repayment schedule. "We will send these to your son via certified mail," Kendra explained, her voice devoid of emotion. "He will be instructed to sign and return them. He will almost certainly refuse. He will likely call you angry and confused. This is expected." His refusal to acknowledge a debt does not invalidate it, especially when we have the bank records of the transfers. His refusal simply becomes another piece of evidence for our file. It demonstrates his intentions. Her strategy was brilliant. It wasn't about getting the money back. It was about changing the narrative. I was no longer the endlessly indulgent father. I was a creditor. The final piece of the puzzle, the operational plan for the wedding itself, was something I had put in place months ago, guided by a flicker of foresight I didn't even know I possessed at the time. When Brittany had insisted on the most expensive vendors in the city, from Otis's catering to Terrence's band, I had agreed. But I had not signed the contracts as Harrison Blackwood private citizen. On the advice of my accountant, I had signed every contract under my corporate entity, Blackwood Designs. It was a simple legal shield, something I did for all large expenditures. But buried in the standard terms and conditions of each contract was a clause Kendra James had reviewed and described as perfect. The clause stated that all services were to be rendered to the satisfaction of the client's designated on-site representative. If this representative was for any reason asked to leave the event, the company reserved the right to consider the contract terminated and all services immediately concluded. The on-site representative for Blackwood Designs on every single contract for that wedding was listed as me, Harrison Blackwood. I had, without realizing it, built my own escape hatch. The trap was not something I had to build. It was something they had unknowingly asked me to set. All the pieces were now in place. My assets were protected. My intentions were legally clarified. And the mechanism for the final public lesson was locked and loaded. All I had to do now was wait for the wedding day. We didn't go home. Instead, we went to a small jazz club downtown, a place called the Blue Note, a refuge tucked away in a quiet alley. It was a place Diane and I used to go, a place filled with the ghosts of happier times. The air was thick with the smell of old wood whiskey and the soulful cry of a saxophone. Otis, Terrence, and I took a small booth in the back, away from the sparse crowd. We didn't talk much. There was nothing left to say. We just sat in the comfortable silence of old friendship, nursing our drinks. I wasn't celebrating. I was mourning. Mourning the son I had lost long before this night. I felt a profound sadness, the heavy, quiet grief of an architect who has just condemned a building he spent his life constructing. The calm was shattered when the doors to the club burst open, letting in a blast of cold night air and a hurricane in a white dress. It was Brittany. Her perfect hair was now slightly disheveled, her makeup was smudged beneath her eyes, and her expensive dress looked like a costume she was desperate to rip off. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Trailing behind her like a ghost was Jordan, his face ashen, his tuxedo, looking 2 sizes too big for his suddenly frail frame. He looked lost, a boy who had followed a storm into a place he didn't belong. They spotted us in the back, and Brittany marched towards our booth, her heels clicking like gunshots on the wooden floor. "You!" she shrieked, her voice raw and ugly, causing the few other patrons in the bar to turn and stare. "How could you do this? How could you be so cruel, so selfish?" She stood over our table, vibrating with rage. Otis and Terrence remained perfectly still, their expressions unreadable, 2 mountains unmoved by her tempest. I didn't move either. I just looked up at her. "You ruined everything," she continued, her voice cracking. "My wedding, my reputation. The best day of my life, and you destroyed it for what? Because of some stupid sentimental song? You are a vindictive, pathetic old man." The insults were meant to provoke, to draw me into her chaos, but I refused. I had spent the last 2 years absorbing her veiled insults. These open ones were almost a relief. Jordan finally found his voice, a weak, pleading sound that was even more pathetic than her rage. "Dad, please," he begged, his hands outstretched as if to ward off a blow. Just stop this. Call them back. We can fix this. Please, Dad, it's my wedding day. It's my wedding. How could you do this to me? He didn't defend her. He didn't apologize for her behavior. He just wanted me to make the consequences disappear. He was completely blind to the fact that he was standing next to the person who had detonated the bomb, and he was begging me to put the building back together. I just sat there and I watched them. I watched the woman my son had chosen, her face twisted with a primal greed and entitlement. And I watched my son, a hollowed-out man, begging me to undo the damage he had allowed to happen. I didn't see a bride and groom. I saw two children throwing a tantrum in the middle of a grocery store because they had been denied a candy bar. Their sound and fury filled the small club, but at our table there was only a profound, unbreakable calm. They were screaming at a wall of silence, and it was driving them mad. Their anger began to curdle into desperation. They had come here expecting a fight, expecting to find me gloating, expecting to have a screaming match. They were not prepared for this. They were not prepared for the quiet, sad finality in my eyes. They were not prepared for a man who had already made his peace with the wreckage. I let their anger wash over our booth, a wave of hot, useless noise that broke against the seawall of our silence. When their words finally ran out, leaving only the ragged sound of their own breathing and the soft lament of the saxophone from the stage, I took a slow sip of my water. I placed the glass down on the coaster with a quiet, deliberate motion. The sound was a period marking the end of their tirade and the beginning of mine. I looked not at Brittany, but at my son. "You're both very emotional," I began, my voice even and calm, a stark contrast to their shrieking. "So let's try to set the emotion aside and just look at the facts. You've made some accusations and you deserve a clear answer. Let's start with tonight. Let's talk about the wedding you seem to believe I destroyed." Brittany opened her mouth to interrupt, but I held up a single finger, a gesture of quiet authority that stopped her cold. "First," I continued, "you are operating under a fundamental misunderstanding. I, Harrison Blackwood, your father, did not pay for your wedding. Blackwood Designs. My corporation paid for your wedding. Every invoice, every deposit, every contract was signed and executed as a corporate event." Jordan's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? That's my company. It's the same thing." "No, Jordan," I said patiently, as if explaining a simple architectural principle to a student. "It is not the same thing. In business and in law, it is a critical distinction. A company is a legal entity with its own rights and obligations, and in this case, Blackwood Designs was the client. Otis's company, Terrence's band, the venue itself, they were all vendors contracted by my company to provide a service for a corporate event. I let that sink in. I was reframing the entire evening, moving it from the realm of family drama into the cold, clear world of contract law. Now, in every one of those contracts, I went on my gaze, unwavering, a contract for which you and Brittany happily approved the budget. There is a standard clause. It's called the Client Representation Clause. It stipulates that all services are to be rendered to the complete satisfaction of the client's designated on-site representative. If that representative is not satisfied, or if that representative is removed from the premises, the vendor has the right to consider the contract fulfilled and immediately conclude all services. I paused, letting them process the words. I could see the first glimmer of dawning horror in Jordan's eyes. Brittany just looked confused, her anger momentarily short-circuited by a conversation she couldn't control. The designated on-site representative for Blackwood Designs on every single one of those contracts, Jordan, was me. I let the statement hang in the air for a moment. "So when your bride looked that representative in the eye and told him to get out and never come back, she wasn't simply being rude to her father-in-law. From a legal and contractual standpoint, she was dismissing the client. She was terminating the agreement on behalf of every vendor present." I gestured to my friends. "Otis and Terrence didn't walk out on your wedding out of some misguided loyalty to me. They walked out because their client left the building. They were professionally and legally obligated to do so. They fulfilled their contract to Blackwood Designs perfectly. There was no drama. There was no revenge. It was just business. A simple, logical consequence of an action. You terminated the contract. They stopped providing the service. It's as simple as that." I let the logic of my explanation settle into the silence of our booth. I saw Jordan struggling with it, trying to find a flaw in the contractual wall I had built. Brittany, however, just looked impatient. She clearly thought this was my only move, a petty trick to ruin her night. She was still a long way from understanding the scope of her defeat. I picked up my glass of water again, the picture of calm. But that, I said, looking from my son to his new wife, that just solves the problem of tonight's unfortunate events. We should really talk about the future. Your future and mine. After all, you both came to my study just a few months ago with a very detailed presentation for my next chapter. It would be rude of me not to return the favor and update you on my own plans. I saw a flicker of unease in Brittany's eyes. This was not following her script. Let's talk about the house. I said, my voice soft but carrying the weight of a final judgment. The lake house. The one you had appraised. The one you planned to sell to fund your new life and to pay for my stay at the Evergreen Meadows community. Jordan flinched as if I had struck him. Brittany's face hardened. You were right about one thing, I continued. It is a valuable asset. Far too valuable to be left in uncertain hands. That is why 2 months ago I had my lawyer finalize the creation of an irrevocable trust. Brittany let out a short, sharp laugh of disbelief. A trust? What are you talking about? You can't do that. Oh, but I can, I said. And I have. The house, the land, everything no longer belongs to me. It is now the sole property of the Diane Blackwood Legacy Trust. It is named after your mother, Jordan. A woman who understood that a home is built with love, not just with wood and stone. I watched Brittany's face. The word irrevocable was a legal term, but she understood its power. It meant permanent. It meant final. The trust has a new beneficiary, I explained, letting each word land with precision. Upon my death, ownership will be transferred to the School of Architecture at Northwood University to fund a permanent scholarship in Diane's name for young, underprivileged students. Her legacy will be to build futures, not to fund lifestyles. The color began to drain from Brittany's face. She was seeing it now. The multi-million-dollar payday, the key to the life she believed she was owed, dissolving into smoke right before her eyes. No, she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. No, you're lying. I'm not finished, I said, my voice unwavering. I did make a provision for you, Jordan. The trust grants you lifetime residency in the house. You can live there for free for the rest of your life. For a split second, a desperate hope flared in Brittany's eyes. She saw a loophole, a way to still get what she wanted. But then I delivered the final crushing blow. However, I said, the terms are very clear. As the resident, you are legally responsible for 100% of the property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, and all upkeep. You will never own it, you can never sell it, you can never borrow against it. You can't even change the color of the paint on the walls without written permission from the trust's board, which will be managed by the university. You are not being given an asset, Jordan. You are being given a responsibility. The hope in Brittany's eyes died, replaced by a look of pure, horrified comprehension. Her perfectly constructed world had just been demolished. No, she stammered, shaking her head, the carefully crafted composure shattering into a million pieces. No, you can't. That's our house. That's Jordan's inheritance. I looked at her, my expression calm but my heart heavy. No, Brittany, I said, my voice quiet but absolute. It was never your house, and it was Jordan's birthright, not his inheritance. A birthright he was fully prepared to sell to the highest bidder. I simply did what a good architect always does. I protected the foundation. Brittany was still sputtering her mind, reeling from the loss of the house, but I wasn't finished. There was one final lesson to be taught, and this one was not for her. This was for my son. I turned my full attention to Jordan, and for the first time that night, my voice lost some of its cold detachment, replaced by a quiet, profound sadness. And that just leaves one last piece of business, I said, my eyes locked on his. The money. He looked at me confused, like a man already knocked down who couldn't imagine another blow was coming. The money, Dad. What are you talking about? The wedding, no, son, I said gently. Not the wedding. That was a corporate expense, and the books on that are now closed. I'm talking about the other money. The $125,000 that you and Brittany referred to as my investment in your various projects. I saw a flash of fear in his eyes. He knew what I was talking about. The failed app. The Bali vacation disguised as a marketing trip. The money he had taken so easily, so thoughtlessly. Those were gifts, Dad, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. You gave us that money to help us get started. That's an interesting perspective, I said, my voice hardening slightly. Because I don't remember signing any gift tax forms. I don't remember any conversations where the word gift was used. I remember you asking for seed capital. I remember you asking for an investment. Those are business terms, Jordan. And business investments are expected to show a return, or at the very least, they are expected to be paid back. I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out 2 envelopes. I slid them across the table. They landed in front of him with a soft, final sound. 2 weeks ago, I explained my lawyer sent you 2 registered letters containing legally drafted promissory notes formalizing those amounts as personal loans from me to you. You refused to sign for them. That's all right. Your refusal has been noted. These are your copies. He stared at the envelopes as if they were venomous snakes. He didn't touch them. He looked up at me, his face a canvas of disbelief and dawning horror. The easy confidence he had worn like a costume was gone, stripped away to reveal the frightened, insecure boy underneath. He was finally beginning to understand. This wasn't an impulsive act of anger. This wasn't a father having a tantrum. This was a long-planned, meticulously executed strategy. He was looking at the results of months of quiet documentation of every lie and manipulation being cataloged and filed away. He had thought I was blind, but I had been watching everything through a magnifying glass.
What is this?
He whispered, his voice trembling. You're making me pay it back. Of course you're paying it back, I said, my voice calm but absolute. With interest. It's a debt, Jordan, a significant one. And you are now officially in default. My lawyer will be in touch with you next week to discuss a repayment schedule. I would advise you to take her call. I saw the last of his composure crumble. The full weight of his new reality came crashing down on him. There would be no multi-million-dollar house. There would be no endless supply of cash from his father. There was only a mountain of debt and a life he now had to figure out how to pay for on his own. He wasn't just losing an inheritance. He was losing his safety net, his crutch, his lifelong get-out-of-jail-free card. He was for the very first time in his 35 years completely and utterly on his own. And the terror of that realization was written all over his face. He wasn't looking at his father anymore. He was looking at a stranger, a creditor, a man who had just handed him the bill for his betrayal. Brittany was a statue of shattered glass, her beautiful, cruel face finally broken. Jordan just stared at the envelopes on the table, the physical proof of his colossal miscalculation. The fight was over. All that was left was to deliver the final lesson. I looked at my son, and the last of my anger dissolved, leaving only a vast, aching sadness. I wasn't looking at an enemy. I was looking at a casualty of his own weak character, a boy who had been given a map but had chosen to follow a mirage. Look at you both, I said, and my voice was no longer the voice of a creditor or a strategist. It was the voice of a father speaking from the ruins of a dream. Look at what you've become. You are so obsessed with building a brand, Brittany, that you forgot to build a character. And you, Jordan, you were so desperate to impress her, so desperate for a shortcut to a life you felt you deserved that you were willing to sell the very ground on which you were raised. I shook my head, not in anger but in pity. You talk about my legacy as if it's a pile of money I was hoarding. You don't understand what a legacy is. It's not what you leave for people. It's what you leave in people. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound that was more powerful in the quiet club than any shout. Your mother and I started with nothing. We built a life, a business, a home. We built it on a foundation of respect, hard work, and loyalty. That is the legacy. The money is just a byproduct. It's the lumber left over after the house is built. You were so focused on the lumber that you decided to dynamite the foundation to get to it. Brittany made a small, wounded sound and finally sank into the booth, her body seeming to fold in on itself. The fight was gone. The fury was gone. All that was left was a hollow shell. Her dream had been a house of cards, and I had just removed the bottom one. But my final words were for my son. You called the house your inheritance, I said, my voice heavy with the weight of the lesson. You were wrong. An inheritance is something you are given. A birthright is something you are a part of. That house, that life, that foundation, that was your birthright. You didn't have to earn it. You just had to respect it, to protect it, to build upon it. But you didn't. You saw it as a commodity, something to be sold off to the highest bidder to fund a life of cheap imitations and empty impressions. He finally looked up at me, and in his eyes for the first time I saw something other than fear or entitlement. I saw a flicker of comprehension. He wasn't looking at the old man. He had dismissed the walking ATM he had taken for granted. He was seeing the architect, the man who designed and built things to last. The man who understood that a structure is only as strong as its foundation. He was seeing the father he had lost not because I had left, but because he had wandered so far away. The recognition was a slow, agonizing dawn on his face, and I knew it would be a pain he would carry for the rest of his life. I stood up, placing a few bills on the table to cover our drinks. Otis and Terrence stood with me. "I did not do this to you," I said, my voice clear and final. "I simply stopped you from doing it to yourselves and to me. You chose the materials. You drew the flawed blueprint. I am just the building inspector condemning a structure that was never meant to stand." And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving them sitting in the rubble of the life they had tried to build. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The lesson was complete. The marriage of Jordan Blackwood and Brittany Miller, a union built on the promise of a 7-figure inheritance, did not last the week. Their shared future was a business plan, and I had just declared it bankrupt. The arguments that followed were not the passionate fights of disillusioned lovers. They were the bitter, frantic negotiations of business partners turning on each other after a catastrophic failure. I wasn't there to hear them, but I could imagine the conversations. I had seen the blueprints of their characters, and I knew how they would react under pressure. Brittany, the ruthless CEO of their 2-person corporation, would have accused Jordan of incompetence, of weakness. She would have raged at him for not having a better handle on his own father, for failing to secure the assets. She would have seen his weakness not as a character flaw, but as a business liability that had cost her everything. And Jordan, for his part, would have finally seen the cold, hard machinery beneath her beautiful exterior. His resentment, long suppressed in his desire to please her, would have surfaced. He would have blamed her for pushing him, for filling his head with ideas of brands and lifestyles, for teaching him to be ashamed of the solid, respectable world he came from. Their shared dream, once a glittering palace in the sky, was now just a pile of rubble they were throwing at each other. Their love had been collateral for a loan that had been called in. Without the money, they had nothing in common. The end was inevitable. Brittany was a pragmatist above all else. When a brand fails, you don't stick around out of loyalty. You rebrand. About a month after the wedding, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she had moved out. There was no dramatic divorce proceeding. It was more like a corporate dissolution. She packed her things, hired a lawyer to ensure there were no lingering financial ties, and vanished from Jordan's life as cleanly as if she had never been there. She was cutting her losses, moving on to find a new, more promising venture. She had no time to waste on a failed project. Her departure left Jordan alone in the sleek, minimalist apartment they had rented in anticipation of their new life, an apartment they could no longer afford. He was a king left alone in an empty castle surrounded by the expensive, soulless furniture that Brittany had chosen, each piece a monument to a future that would never arrive. And then the real consequences began. The polite, implacable letters from Kendra James's office started arriving. They weren't threats. They were business communications. A proposed repayment schedule for the $125,000 debt. Reminders of the penalties for non-payment. Jordan, who had never had to worry about money a day in his life, was now forced to stare at a spreadsheet that detailed in black and white the true cost of his choices. He had to sell the expensive car Brittany had insisted they buy. He had to break the lease on the apartment. He had to look for a job, a real job, one that paid a salary based on his skills, not his father's name. The world, which had always been a soft, forgiving place for him, had suddenly become hard and unyielding. For the first time, he was facing the cold, impartial logic of cause and effect. He was no longer the son of Harrison Blackwood, the prominent architect. He was just Jordan Blackwood, a man with a mountain of debt, a failed marriage, and a future he had to build from scratch, all by himself. He had lost his wife, he had lost the house, he had lost the money. But the most profound loss, the one I knew he was grappling with in the silence of his new, smaller life, was the loss of his father's respect. And that was a debt no amount of money could ever repay. 6 months passed. The raw, sharp edges of the event had softened into a dull ache in my heart. I didn't feel joy in what I had done. There is no joy in amputating a part of yourself to save the whole. But in the quiet moments, I felt a profound and unshakable peace. It was the peace of a man who had faced a storm and was still standing on solid ground. I had protected what was most sacred to me, the memory of my wife and the integrity of a lifetime of work. The cost was high, but the cost of inaction would have been higher. It would have been the slow, corrosive death of my own soul. One bright, clear autumn morning, I stood on the campus of my old university. The air was crisp and the leaves were turning shades of gold and crimson. A small crowd had gathered on a manicured lawn where a new building was about to be constructed. A large banner fluttered in the breeze, and on it were the words, "The future site of the Diane Blackwood Center for Architectural Innovation." I wasn't there as a donor seeking recognition. I was there as a quiet witness to a promise being kept. The dean of the school was at a podium speaking about the transformative power of education, about giving a chance to those with talent but without means. He spoke about Diane, about her passion for nurturing young minds. He spoke about the scholarship that would bear her name, a scholarship funded by the trust, a legacy that would build hundreds of futures. As he spoke, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the crowd, partially hidden by the shade of a large oak tree. It was Jordan. He was thinner and he looked older. He was dressed simply in a worn jacket and jeans. He was alone. He wasn't there as a guest of honor. He was just there watching. He must have known this day was coming. Our eyes met across the lawn. There was no anger in his gaze, no resentment. There was only a quiet, weary acknowledgement. He looked at me, and for the first time I think he truly saw the man I was, the architect who had to tear down a flawed structure to save the integrity of the design. In his eyes I saw the beginning of a long, hard road toward understanding. I gave him a slow, single nod. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, not yet. It was a gesture of recognition. I see you. I see you standing here. I see you starting over. He held my gaze for a moment longer, then gave a barely perceptible nod in return before turning and walking away, disappearing into the campus crowd. He hadn't come to ask for anything. He had just come to see it, to see what had been built in the place of what he had lost. And I knew in that moment that there was hope, a distant hope perhaps, for a day when we could sit down and talk, not as creditor and debtor, not as victor and vanquished, but as a father and a son who had both survived a painful demolition and were now faced with the challenge of building something new. The dean finished his speech, and I was handed a ceremonial silver shovel. I walked to the designated spot and joined the others. I felt the solid weight of the shovel in my hands. It felt familiar, comfortable. I pushed the blade into the soft earth. The sound it made was not an ending, it was a beginning. It was the sound of a new foundation being laid, a legacy, not of money, but of opportunity. A legacy that would stand long after I was gone. A legacy that was finally and truly secure. This whole experience taught me a difficult but necessary lesson. A family, much like a building, requires a foundation of mutual respect to stand strong. For years I allowed that foundation to be chipped away in the name of a false peace, mistaking my generosity for love when it was only enabling disrespect. I have learned that true strength isn't found in endless giving, but in the wisdom to set firm boundaries. Sometimes the most loving act is not to keep patching the cracks, but to condemn a rotten structure in order to protect the ground on which it stands. I've shared my story, and now I'd love to hear a piece of yours. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your own legacy or self-respect? Let me know in the comments, and please tell me where in the world you're watching from. If my story resonated with you, show your support by liking this video and subscribing for more.